Major developments underway today in the Israel-Hamas war. Multiple sources, including a diplomat with knowledge of the talks, tell NBC News that Israel, Hamas, and U.S. negotiators are closing in on a deal to release some of the nearly 240 hostages who were kidnapped by Hamas in its October 7th attack. Now, it would include a possible pause in fighting for several days to get the hostages out. The sources, however, emphasize that nothing has been finalized yet and that any tentative deal could still fall apart. Deputy National Security Advisor Jon Finer spoke to my colleague Kristen Welker this morning on Meet the Press about what could be included in the deal, including how many hostages could be released.
I believe we are closer than we have been in quite some time, maybe closer than we have been since the beginning of this process. We are talking about considerably more than 12. But beyond that, I want to see where this goes and don't want to say anything that would jeopardize actually completion of the deal, which is the most important thing.
It's not clear if any of the 10 Americans, including a 3-year-old girl, would be among the hostages released. And the timing of this deal, it couldn't be more urgent, with the Israel Defense Forces announcing this week that the bodies of at least 2 hostages have been found in Gaza. Joining me now to discuss is New York Times White House correspondent Katie Rogers, former Clinton White House aide Keith Boykin, and former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Joel Rubin in the Obama administration. We are going to talk about this latest development in a moment, but first, Katie, you wrote a book about First Ladies, American women, the transformation of the modern First Lady from Hillary Clinton to Jill Biden. What can you tell us about former First Lady Rosalynn Carter? We have been talking about her impact on the office of the First Lady and just how she transformed the role for First Ladies after her.
Yeah, I think what was so revolutionary about her is that she was a full partner to her husband, and it was always completely normal with them. It was always seen as a given that she would be alongside her husband campaigning and taking in messages from the American people, namely with running into people with mental health concerns and caregiving concerns on the campaign trail and really tying that into her role as First Lady. She sat in regularly on cabinet meetings and National Security Council meetings. That was something that just was not done with regularity until she was First Lady. And it was something that the Carters didn't treat as unusual. It was just they were a package deal almost, years before Bill and Hillary Clinton would sort of present themselves to the American people stylistically in a very different way. But the Carters were completely full partners. And the other interesting thing about Rosalynn Carter is that she established really what we know as the modern East Wing. She was the first First Lady to name a chief of staff to the East Wing, a woman named Edith Doble, and really laid the groundwork for what we think of the East Wing today.
Definitely laid the groundwork. She also was very involved in foreign policy. And I previously, earlier in this hour, spoke with my colleague Andrea Mitchell, who talked about how she advised former President Carter during the Camp David Accords. And I cannot help but think of the slight similarities between the hostage situation in Iran during the Camp David Accords and the current situation that the U.S. and Israel find themselves in, negotiating the release, attempting to negotiate the release of 240 hostages. You have some reporting, Katie, and you pointed out in your latest reporting, actually, that in Jon Finer's interview that I just played a piece of with Kristen Welker, that he didn't specify whether U.S. officials believed Israel was following international law and how they have been conducting their military operations. What does that signal to you?
It signals to me that the Biden administration is really doing all it can to message and signal that it does not want to be, as they say, judge and jury around what Israel is doing right now to eradicate Hamas. During AIPAC, I was in San Francisco this week, and really, even though the summit there was focused much on the president's meeting with Xi Jinping of China, his aides were working pretty much around the clock on relaying what was going on the ground in Gaza. And I think that the administration really operates from a place of Hamas is not going to relent. Hamas is going to keep attacking. And that is sort of the decision the president has made, regardless of the criticism that has been directed his way. And I think, based on how officials around him are operating, they really don't want to get into the questions of international law right now, even as there is so much criticism about what is being done and how Israel's operation is being carried out.
Keith, let's just talk about some of this criticism and how lawmakers are reacting. You have a number of lawmakers now who are talking about potentially conditioning aid to Israel, which is something that has not been done before. A number of lawmakers made the rounds this morning on the Sunday show saying just that. How do you think this is going to play out, Keith? Because I do think that there are growing various factions, if you will, within the Democratic Party apparatus here at home. But the president is balancing that along with his duty internationally and trying to ensure that, that the United States and Israel can still have a good working relationship, that the United States can still be influential. And as I noted yesterday, I think that might be hard for the president to do if he is raking, for lack of a better term, Prime Minister Netanyahu over the coals in public.
Yeah, I think this is a very difficult situation for President Biden because his support for the Israeli offensive in Gaza is extremely unpopular, not only in the nation, but also particularly in the Democratic Party, particularly among young people. And that poses a problem for him because he needs those people to turn out for him to vote in 2024. So there's a real political issue that he's facing and challenge he's facing. There's also the question of what is the end game here? How long does this continue? Even assuming Hamas is eradicated, what does that look like? What comes after Hamas? And where does the United States stand with a post-Hamas Gaza, if that's even a conceivable thing? And in addition to that, what about Bibi Netanyahu? Does the United States really want to be aligned with Netanyahu's government, which is not only unpopular here, but it's unpopular in Israel? So I think the president has put himself in I don't know if he's put himself in, but he's in a position that is very difficult to maneuver out of with a base that is increasingly more pro-Palestine than pro-Israel. And he's got to negotiate his way through that.
In his recent op-ed, President Biden reiterated his support for a two-state solution and the removal of Hamas. Joel, you served in the State Department during the 2014 Gaza war. Talk a little bit about the obstacles to removing Hamas from power while also restabilizing the region. Is this a realistic goal?
You got it, Simone. Look, this is not a simple process. There is not an A that leads to B that leads to C directly. There has to be concurrent activities. And certainly Hamas has played a spoiler. We have to remind everybody about this reality that Hamas since the 1990s has been a primary obstacle to peace between Israel and the Palestinians. Hamas threw out the Palestinian Authority leadership from Gaza in 2007, pushing them to Ramallah, and has its own base of operations in Gaza intended to prevent reconciliation. So a key baseline for any potential for a two-state solution is going to have to be the removal of Hamas from a powerful position in Palestinian politics. But there does need to be an end state, a window of a day after of real diplomacy, Palestinian Authority engagement across both Gaza and the West Bank. And that means engaging our allies in the Arab world to support that kind of dynamic. As we discussed, look, Gaza 2014, this has been a repetitive series of wars and ongoing backs and forth between Israel and Hamas related to Gaza. And I think what we're seeing now is a real determination from the White House to say this is the final one, but we do need to move to a full diplomatic solution between the Israelis and the Palestinians.
Joel Rubin, Keith Boykin, and Katie Rogers, thank you all very, very much.